Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Ruminant Nutrition webinar. This afternoon, I'm going to talk a little bit about feeding cattle and sheep for profit and some of the lessons that I've learnt over the last 30 odd years in teaching and implementing nutritional programs. Firstly, I want to talk about the three most common supplementation mistakes that people make: timing, protein versus energy, and poor diagnosis. I want to talk a little bit about having a positive gross margin and making sure that our economics are good and that we're going to make money out of what we feed. I'm going to talk a little bit about where to from here, and then there's been a lot of questions come in over the last few days, which I'll answer then as we move through the program. So starting out with the three most common mistakes. The first one is getting the timing wrong. Second one, as I mentioned earlier, is feeding energy when protein is needed. And the third is poor diagnosis. I'm going to run through these one at a time. And when it comes to timing, I see so many people feeding the wrong thing at the wrong time, feeding the wrong thing at the right time, feeding the right thing at the wrong time. Unless we get the timing right, we're going to waste a lot of money when it comes to supplementation. And over many years now, I've developed a system of looking at what I call nutritional seasons. Now, these nutritional seasons occur every year. They occur around the same time, but they can vary in length. But a nutritional season basically tells us what's happening in terms of the nutrition of our livestock. So there'll be times when we need to supplement, and there'll be times when we don't. And I'm going to show you and work through both a northern and tropical feed curve and nutritional seasons, and a southern Australian or more temperate feed curve and seasons. But let's start with the northern tropical one. This is a typical tropical set of nutritional seasons. In season one, which is what we call a transitional season, where you've got increasing quality and quantity. And then nutritional season two is a period where we've got still rising quantity, but fairly good quality. And we wouldn't want to be supplementing anything at that time unless the animals required minerals. And again, during the peak quality and quantity period, so nutritional season three here, the only thing that we would need to supplement to animals would be minerals, if that's what they required. Now, as we start to drop off quality, and this is particularly protein in a tropical environment, we've still got plenty of quantity, but our quality is starting to drop off. And in nutritional season 4 is a period when we can actually come in and start providing protein in the form particularly of non-protein nitrogen during that time of the year. Also, the next phase, nutritional season 5, where our quality is even poorer, and we've got declining quantity. Again, we would be using non-protein nitrogen there. And as we switched across to much lower quality, we'd be starting to take minerals, particularly phosphorus, out of any supplement that we had during that period. And then during our long dry season, we've got still declining quality and declining quantity, and we would be supplementing specifically for that season. Now, if we look at a southern or temperate zone, the seasons are slightly different, and here you might have an autumn, for example. The actual time of the year when some of these might occur is quite different, but you're also going to have a transitional period from winter to spring, when you might have a green drought, for example. You've got quality but no quantity at that time, and then as the temperature warms up and the rainfall cuts in, you're going to have high quality and rapidly increasing quantity over your key spring period. It might be that once your spring dries off and you start to get into midsummer, that the quality is going to drop off your feed, but you've still got quantity as you head through towards an autumn break. So that season there, and any one of these seasons, will have a specific period. But that period will change, but the description of what's required for each season will actually be the same. And then you might have an autumn break, and then whatever you were doing would change. So we might be on brown feed through Nutritional Season 3, and that would change to green and growth again when we get into the autumn break, and then we go through winter with entirely different nutritional requirements again. So over a long period of time, I've found that breaking your year up into these nutritional seasons makes it really clear as to what we ought to be feeding in each season and helping us get the timing right, so we're feeding the right thing at the right time. Second biggest mistake that I see is people confusing energy and protein. Now, energy is by far and away the largest requirement, and that's what really drives productivity. So that is determined by the digestibility in your feed, for example. Protein's a much smaller requirement, and it drives the flow of energy into the animal via rumen health. So what protein's doing is essentially driving up, while there's adequate protein there, driving up the rumen ammonia level, which increases the bug population in the rumen, which allows livestock to process more feed. And we really need to understand the difference between those two. So protein drives the rumen and the bug population, which then allows the animals to consume more feed, and that gets more energy into them. But to get more energy into the animal, we paradoxically feed protein. The other very, very important nutrient is water. And an animal should be drinking at around about 30 degrees centigrade, about 10% of its body weight. So regardless of whether we're talking sheep or cattle or small or big, generally you're looking at about 10% of body weight. Now, as temperature drops, water intakes will fall away, and as temperature increases, water intakes will significantly increase. And it's quite possible in heat wave conditions for livestock to drink double that, so up to about 6% of body weight in heat wave conditions. And water is a very, very important nutrient. And it's one of those things that often we don't measure the intake of water, but over a long period of time now with people using water medicators, it's become quite evident that in a lot of cases, water intake is nowhere near where it should be. And so we need some strategies around improving water intake. The old sigmoid curve, if we have a look at that, you'll see that generally in phase 1, where we've got low quantity, that's when we're most likely to have low energy. Conversely, when we've got plenty of quantity, that's when we're more likely to run into a protein problem. So if we run into an energy problem in phase 1, it basically means that we are either overstocked or haven't conserved enough feed to get through the season that we need to get through. We can, over time, with many species, particularly introduced and better quality species, by grazing plants in phase 2, we can change the digestibility of those plants when they reach phase 2. That means that we can increase the digestibility and therefore the energy available in older plants through grazing management. However, grazing management does not improve protein level in plants. So if we have good digestibility but low protein level, we're going to get low animal production. Now that's the circumstance though, if you've got good digestibility, let's say anything above 52, 53% digestibility, you've got potential for production. But if the protein level in your feed is less than 7 or 8%, animals won't have enough function, rumen function, to actually access that energy. And so what we need to feed in those circumstances is a protein source, and that will improve the rumen function and get animals eating more feed, and that will get more energy through the animal. The best way to know what phase your plants are in is to actually look at the dung. Now, generally a dung in phase 1 is going to be fairly splattered, and there was a question that came up over the weekend of just reviewing the dung scores, and particularly phase 1. So phase 1 is going to be generally very splattered and very flat. Now, the reason for that is that there's very little fibre in the diet and the dung is being processed through the rumen very, very quickly. When we move into a phase 2 diet, the dung starts to sit up and generally it'll have that sort of ring in the middle of it, but it may also sit up a lot higher than the one you can see there. And normally dung pat size in phase 2 is quite large. And it's large because livestock are producing, or are processing, I should say, a lot of dry matter, and therefore there's quite a lot of dung being produced out the other end. And when you get up into phase 3, you'll start to see that dung heap up. Now we can improve that heaping up with some nitrogen or some protein at that stage, and we can bring that down slightly, but we can't overcome the basic problem with digestibility in the feed. Although with added protein, we can get more feed through the animal. The second indicator with dung is that if you actually get in and work that dung between your fingers, you'll find in phase 1 there's virtually no fibre. In phase 2, you'll find very fine, very small particle length, indicating that most of the fibre is actually being processed. But when you look inside a phase 3 dung pat, you're actually going to find large chunks of fibre, which means that that fibre is not being broken down by the rumen, and therefore, or the energy that's still in that feed is actually passing out through the other end, and your livestock are not accessing that energy. Sheep, it's the reverse. So when you're looking at sheep, phase 1, phase 2, the dung sticks together, and as they move in towards phase 3, the dung scatters. And in fact, phase 1 can be a little bit like cattle. Phase 1 dung, it can be very, very loose in sheep as well. One of the things that's important to understand, particularly in the difference between protein and energy, is the difference between supplementation and substitution. Supplementation is we're making up for a protein and or mineral deficiency in the feed. So we talk about supplementing animals, but the reality is we're actually supplementing something that's missing in our pastures. Supplementation is usually very economic, particularly if we get the timing right and the supplement right. On the other hand, substitution feeding is where we're replacing energy which should be in the standing forage, so that's hay, silage, grain, molasses, etc., where we're actually replacing energy that should be in the paddock. And that's a whole different set of economics when you start looking at feeding energy, because energy is the largest amount of feed that you have to provide your livestock, and the cheapest source of that is the forage standing in the paddock. The third thing that I think is one of the biggest mistakes that I see continuously is undiagnosed deficiencies and or stuff not being properly diagnosed. And if we start with the macronutrients, the most common ones of those are phosphorus deficiency, sodium deficiency, sulfur, and magnesium. There are other macronutrients, but those are the most common macronutrient deficiencies. One way to diagnose some of those, particularly phosphorus, is with soil samples. I find that's not terribly reliable because it's a couple of spots removed from the animal. I find that diagnosing phosphorus by analysing dung at a time of the year when animals are not growing rapidly but also above maintenance is probably the best diagnostic tool for looking at a phosphorus deficiency. Sodium, we often can diagnose through the saliva, but it's just as easy to go and feed some salt out and see what the reaction to animals is. If animals go and gorge salt, keep it up to them for probably 10 to 14 days and the gorging will then drop off. At that point, their sodium is in balance and the animals are okay. Sulfur is frequently a deficiency, particularly on basalt-derived country. It's deficient in those soils and therefore deficient in those plants. Very easy one to feed out because it's required in quite small quantities. And many of you down south will be well aware of magnesium deficiencies and its relationship with grass tetany, etc. There was also a question that came up about diagnosing micronutrient deficiencies. And again, probably the most common of these would be cobalt, selenium, zinc, or copper. I find the best way to diagnose these is with boluses, and you can get cobalt bullets, selenium and copper needles that you can put inside the rumen of animals. So if you take 20 or 30 animals in a mob, put those boluses in them, weigh another 20 or 30 individual animals, come back months later or 6 months later, weigh those same animals, and if there's no difference between them, then you know that you have no economic micronutrient deficiency, particularly of those elements. Zinc deficiency is also quite common, and one of the symptoms of that often is animals wanting to stand in water, because one of the effects of a zinc deficiency is to heat up the hocks. So if you've got animals standing in your troughs a lot, then perhaps have a look at and have a look for a zinc deficiency. We've mentioned water intake, and then of course the other really big one is protein deficiency, and that can be also relatively easily diagnosed by looking at fecal nitrogen. Now in Northern Australia we can do fecal NIRS, that's near infrared radiant spectroscopy on dung samples, and make a diagnosis about a protein deficiency. I find that even within that, the fecal nitrogen level is the best indicator of a protein deficiency. And my rule of thumb is that when the protein fecal nitrogen level, I should say, falls below 1.3% in the dung of cattle and sheep, then animals will respond to additional protein. So it's a relatively easy measure, and one that virtually any laboratory can actually do for you. But of course it's critical that you're going to make money out of supplementation. And you might want to make a note of this. You do not make money out of maintenance. So we don't want to be supplementing for maintenance. We don't want to be running around with big, overweight, oversized animals, because that is all maintenance and we're not going to make money out of that. The only exception to making money out of maintenance is maintaining the body condition score of cows and ewes, because that in fact turns into production. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So whenever you're going to start a supplementation program, it's important that you have a look at the economics. So I've put together just 3 simple little pro formas here that I'll just run through very quickly, and it's just to illustrate to you the way of looking at whether you're going to make money out of supplementation before you start it. And then of course you've got to monitor this after you've started to make sure that your assumptions were correct. So let's assume that I was going to feed some steers here for 60 days. The supplement's going to cost me $700 a tonne landed. Average daily intake 500 grams a day. So I'm assuming, for example, that that's that is copra, for example. So I'm feeding 500 grams a day. So the cost of supplement per head per day is 35 cents. Therefore, if I fed for 60 days, it's going to cost me $21 per animal. There's an opportunity cost in that. The interest on that feed is $35. So my total cost, $2,100. My estimated average daily gain with supplementation is 0.6. Without supplementation, 0.2. So my estimated weight gain due to the supplementation is 0.4 a day. And let's say that's got a value at the moment of $2.50. So the extra gain I'm going to get is 24 kgs per head, and the value of that is $60. So I've got to have about a $6,000 income for a $3,800 expense. So $3,800 gross margin. Now I need to add some overheads to that because you don't feed this stuff out for nothing, or it doesn't feed itself out. And probably the most important number then is the benefit cost ratio. So you'll see there we've got a benefit cost ratio of 2.2 to 1. That means for every dollar you spend on supplementation under those assumptions, you would get $2.28 back. Now that's reasonable. You'd probably want to, you'd prefer that that was a little bit higher. But let's look at some ewes, for example, feeding some ewes prior to joining. And the purpose obviously of feeding ewes prior to joining is to get the body condition score up to 3+ for joining. I've just put 90 days in there and $900 a tonne of feed and 10 grams a day of supplement. So that's a total cost of per 1,000 ewes of $891. So let's assume that I can take them from condition score 2 to condition score 3, which is going to give me 22% increase in conception rate. I've got some losses, general losses from conception to weaning. Value of an additional weaner is $50. So that estimated gross margin, 9,000 less some overhead, so I expect to make 8,500 out of that per 1,000 ewes, which has a 7 to 1 benefit cost ratio. And my break even is I would only need 28 more lambs to break even on that operation. And finally, let's have a look at breeding in cattle. Same sort of thing. We're looking to maintain or increase body condition score for calving. So I'm going to assume here that I've got 150 days on supplement, $1,000 a tonne landed for supplements, 150 grams a day average intake. I'm assuming that I'm going to increase the body condition score from 2.5 to 3.5. So that's 1 unit, which will increase my conception by 30%. I'm going to lose 10% of those of weaners from conception. So I'm going to get an extra 27 weaners at say $350. So basically that comes down to where my gross margin is 15,900 and 15,400 after costs. So 1.78 to 1 benefit cost ratio. Break even is an extra 9 carbs. So whenever you're going to do a supplementation program, it's fairly important that you run through these types of numbers just to make sure that you're actually going to make some money out of it. Now I've got a whole lot of questions that I want to get through. Before we do, I just want to talk about where we can go from here with some ongoing support with nutrition. Over the last couple of years, we've been developing an online nutrition course, and you can do that either online or you can get all the hard copies, including the books and the CDs, etc. Now those are available right now. If you wanted to go onto the website there, www.rcsnutrition.com.au, you can sign up for those and start work on those immediately. There's a whole lot of tools within each of those, and just to give you an example, if you get the hard copy, you'll obviously get the nutrition book access for 12 months online with questions, etc. There's online video training modules, there's all sorts of stuff, that resources and things that you can actually download from the website. And one of the things that we'll get with both of these for signing up fairly shortly is 6 monthly telecalls with myself, answering individual questions and sorting through issues and things that you have. My reason for doing this, I've been teaching nutrition now for probably 25, 30 years and have a 1-day nutrition course, which costs around about $700 or $800 plus your time away. So what we've attempted to do now is put all of that plus more into these programs here to allow you to do this at home and still interact with us and still have your questions answered. So if you'd like to learn a lot more about nutrition and pursue some of the things we've been talking about today, then I'd really recommend that you jump in on one of those programs. If you're a bit of a an older person like myself, you probably like the hard copy. So you've got books and CDs and all that sort of stuff that you can work through by yourself. Otherwise, everything's accessible online. And some of the books are still in printing, but all the online stuff is uploadable immediately if you want to go to that. So I look forward to having some of you on board with that program. Now, there's a lot of questions that people have sent in, and I just want to run through these now, and I think this is where we'll get the most value out of today's webinar. First one was about reviewing dung scores, and I think we've already done that. The second question is about organics and using degradable protein within an organic system. The question was, is there sufficient degradable protein in something like copra meal to feed on its own in an organic system? Well, basically the answer to that question is no. Copra is relatively low in protein, so it's about 22% crude protein, and only 30% of that is degradable protein. So to put that in context, if you were to feed 1 kilogram of copra per head per day, that would be 220 grams of total crude protein, of which about 70 grams would be degradable protein. And that would be equivalent to feeding less than 100 grams of a urea supplement with 30% urea in it in terms of degradable protein. But when it comes to organics, you don't really have a lot of choice. You need a protein source, and copra is about the only reliable one which is organic. So I would just go ahead with that one, Mark, and use whatever you can get. There's a couple of questions about Beachport, and these come up every time. And so let me try and answer the Beachport questions. The question was, I'd like to know if there's any evidence of Beachport supplement being of any great advantage to cattle growth weights, or is it a waste of money? I think the first thing is there are two types of Beachport. There's a white cap, which is the mineral supplementation one, and there's the green cap, which is the electrolytes. I believe the electrolyte is a good product, and if you're trucking or shipping cattle, then putting electrolytes through the water is probably a good idea. Now, in terms of the white cap, and there's now white cap plus P, basically the amount of P or sodium or nitrogen that they're going to get out of Beachport is insignificant. When I look at analysing the components of Beachport and the daily intakes that are recommended, the only element that comes within a bull's roar of meeting daily requirements is cobalt. So if you have a cobalt deficiency, then Beachport is probably going to be fairly useful to you. Now, when you look at it from a nutritional theory point of view, you cannot find what would be in Beachport that would make it work. And certainly for the macronutrients like phosphorus, I can definitely tell you that that's not going to be doing you any good. But a number of people whose opinions I trust have told me that they reckon they're getting good results out of Beachport, and therefore I can't dismiss it out of hand. And the reason I don't dismiss it out of hand is that it's got some products in it that I think are probably rumen stimulating. And some of those are components of seaweed and some humates, which I think there's evidence that they can stimulate the rumen. But it's very, very hard to see that at the quantities you are feeding that it's actually going to be doing you much good at all. There was also another question about Beachport and using urea phosphate or Beachport, and they're actually two different things. If you're going to water medicate with urea and phosphorus, then you would use urea phosphate through a major water medicator, something like a NutriDose. The amount of urea and phosphorus, as I just mentioned, that you're going to get out of Beachport is minute and probably not going to do you much good. There's a good question here about change of diet. Are we better off having a lower nutrition feed that is stable all year round, such as grasses, etc., than moving cattle between dry feed in summer to oats, barley or other annual crops? It seems my stock go backwards for a long time due to the change in feed, and this may negate the benefits of the cereal crop. There's a couple of answers to that question, and it's not so much the change of feed, it's probably due to the fact that the oats or the barley that you're feeding is too hot for the animals and there is inadequate roughage in the system. Now, all biology, whether we're talking a rumen or whether we're talking soils, operate around a carbon-nitrogen ratio. And when you're feeding an animal oats that's pumped up, or barley, whatever it is that's pumped up with nitrogen, you've got probably 25-26% crude protein equivalent in the diet, which is at least 10 to 12% higher than the animal can cope with. So you can do two things at that point. One is add roughage, so adding very poor quality hay or opening up your paddocks to that old grass so that the animals can choose where they go during the day, and they'll spend a fair amount of time out on the old grass, and that'll help them balance that carbon-nitrogen ratio. The second thing, and this also applies to very hot clover diets, is that you can also remove nitrogen from the rumen, and you can remove that using bentonite. So if you fed bentonite, it will grab some of that nitrogen and take it out in the feces. So that will also help balance the carbon-nitrogen ratio. The second simple trick to use whenever you're changing significant diets like that is to have animals on a diet, some animals on that feed before you put the main mob with them. So in other words, if you were going to put animals onto oats, you need 2 or 3 or 4 animals on that oats for 2 to 3 weeks before you're going to put the main mob in, so that their rumen has actually got time to adjust to that particular feed, and the rumen bugs will have adjusted to that feed. Then when you put your main mob in, they can cross-inoculate quickly with the bacteria and the bugs that are in the rumen of those animals that are already adjusted. The biggest problem for your animals when you take them off a dry feed, for example, and throw them straight into that oats, is that they don't have the bug population to consume that feed. So cross-inoculation is a great trick to use, whether you're trading, even you're bringing animals onto the place, or changing feeds. Basically just put some of your own animals with those animals or on the new feed, and then that will help settle them down and get them functioning quicker. Another one here about compensatory gain. If weaner cattle are not supplemented with urea through their first winter, will they catch up to supplemented weaners by the end of the following wet season? The short answer to that, Jeff, is yes. Normally, if you have weight loss during that first dry season leading up to your first growing season, weight loss can be compensated. However, if your weaners are either maintaining or going ahead slightly for that second half of the year, then you won't have compensatory gain. So compensation is for loss. So generally, if stock were going to lose weight, dry stock that is, and you were going to sell them sometime a year later, it generally doesn't pay to supplement. But if you're going to sell them in the short term, or they were having a very small gain and you were able to increase the size of that gain slightly, then that gain is actually held on to. Question about phosphorus, phosphorus on dry feed. When the grass is dried off, is it still essential to supplement phosphorus if nitrogen has become the limiting nutrient? And the general answer to that question is no, particularly for dry stock. So if you have cows that are dried off, or steers, obviously, then you would not feed phosphorus in the dry season if they weren't growing. But if you put them on oats or barley in the dry season and really push their growth rate, then feeding phosphorus can actually improve productivity. Often you could have a lot of phosphorus in the soil under an oats crop, but not enough for the animal due to the significant increase in protein and energy available under that oats crop. We talked a little bit about trace minerals earlier, and this is trace minerals, micronutrients like copper, cobalt, selenium are suspected to restrict growth of sheep. I think generally, Rick, if you've got those deficiencies, they are generally worth supplementing. The trick, of course, is how to, and I prefer the boluses, particularly for breeding animals that you're going to have on the place for a long period of time, so that you get the value out of them. Otherwise, look for some supplements that have got those trace minerals in them. Trace minerals are required in micro quantities, but they can have a significant impact on productivity. So what's the best way to achieve higher lamb birth weights when ewes are grazing on quite fibrous stage 3 C4 grasses to improve lamb survival, particularly twins? Brett, the key to both lamb survival and higher birth weights is body condition score of the ewe. And that's going to be body condition score at mating or joining and body condition score at lambing. For example, if you reduce the body condition score of your ewes by 1 body condition score, it will reduce the birth weight of your lambs by about 0.4 to 0.5 of a kilo due to lower nutrition going into the fetus. And that half a kilo in your lamb birth weight can have a significant impact on survival rate. It's particularly important that your ewes are in that body condition score 3+ in the second half of pregnancy. So the third trimester and halfway through the second or the middle trimester. So I think it comes down then to what's it take to either get the body condition score of your ewes up or maintain the body condition score of your ewes. Now, if you're weaned early enough, got the lambs off, maintained your ewes in body condition score 3, going through summer on stage 3 C4 grasses, you would want to be feeding a degradable protein, such as urea, which is okay for adult ewes, or lupins if you're worried about urea. Feed that over summer to get the protein level up and maintain the body condition score of the ewes. If your body condition score is already low at joining, then you've got to be very careful about what you put into those ewes during the third trimester, because you'll then be putting significant amount of energy into the lamb rather than into the ewe itself. Another one on sheep reproduction. What effect might you expect of a ewe hogget having limited nutrition over the autumn period, 10 to 12 months of age, on her lifetime reproductive performance? Again, Bert, this comes back to body condition score. 0.1 body condition score can make about 0.2 of a kilogram difference in clean fleece weight in the progeny, and 0.4 lower micron in progeny. So the critical thing again is body condition score, and I presume that those ewe hoggets are being mated over the autumn period. The critical thing was really, and you probably missed that period now, was over summer to use a supplement, but principally a protein-based supplement, to get the body condition score of those hoggets up that period, so it's up for mating in autumn. Another question on sheep is lupins a good protein source when there's still dry feed coming out of summer for finishing lambs without the dreaded check from grains like barley? Good question, and you've answered your own question correctly. Lupins are a good protein source. You can feed lupins in one of three ways. You can crush them, you can crack them, or you can leave them whole. Generally, cracked is going to give you a better source of degradable protein, which is probably what you're going to need more for finishing lambs. The other thing is that if the cracked lupin is not giving you enough productivity to finish your lambs, the other thing that you can do is feed copra during that period as well, and that will also add to the growth rate and finishing rate of your lambs. Another question on here about gut health. I've heard that putting out supplements is a waste of time unless gut health is in order. Can you suggest ways to get gut health in order, for example, probiotics? I think the answer to that question is that it's actually supplementation that gets gut health in order. It's certainly gut health is primary to the health of your livestock, and that comes down principally to the rumen population, the bug population, and the rumen ammonia level. And that means feeding with protein when you have dry feed available is going to increase the bug population and therefore increase the amount of energy going through to the rumen. So I wouldn't worry about things like probiotics. The most important thing that you can do for gut health in the rumen is make sure that there is adequate protein in the diet all year round to keep that rumen functioning as well as you can. The question on pricing protein, how do you put a price on protein in a feed ration? Another good question. Let's take urea, for example. The way, I'll go back a step, the way that protein is actually calculated is to take the nitrogen level of a feed and multiply it by 6.25. So if I've got 100 grams of urea, 100 grams of urea will have 46 grams of nitrogen in it. Multiplied by 6.25 is 286 grams of protein equivalent. So therefore a brew with 30% urea in it is actually 86% crude protein equivalent. Copra is $22 crude protein, cottonseed meal around about 44% crude protein. So if you wanted to know the price per tonne, so if you had a urea supplement that was say $1,000 a tonne at 86% crude protein, then you multiply the price per tonne by 86%. And price of copra might be say $700 a tonne multiplied by 22%, and that's your price per tonne. Basically using that percentage to get to the price per tonne. Question about early weaning, and there's a couple of these. Early wean calves around the 150, 160 kilos requirements and possible feed types. Generally, you can wean calves down to 60 kilos, 60 to 65 kilos quite successfully. And you can wean lambs down to around about 14 kilos successfully. But the critical thing then is what those animals are fed after weaning, and they must be given a complete replacement ration. So that it's got to be a very good quality ration that basically replaces milk. So if we're looking at early weaning calves, they should be fed that ration up to around that 150, 160 kilos. From 150 to 180 kilos, those calves can be on a good quality bypass protein such as cottonseed meal. The cottonseed meal is about 50% bypass and quite high in protein, so that would be a very good source. Alternatively, you could use copra. Now, once they're at 180 kgs, the rumen is fully developed, and from that point on, they can go on urea supplements, but generally not very high urea, so you'd want to be keep the urea level down, but the rumen is then able to handle urea supplements from about that 180 kilos on. All right, a couple of questions now about the brew. If I feed a urea loose lick to maiden heifers in their third trimester, will this cause large fetuses and calving difficulty? The answer to that is generally no. If you're feeding urea in the third trimester, you're essentially at maintaining the animal rather than boosting its production. If you were to feed a bypass protein or energy in that third trimester, the chances are that you would be boosting animal production or boosting the fetus, I should say. So any big boost in energy, which would come about through bypass protein or an energy feed in the third trimester, is going to increase the size of the fetus. But normally with a dry lick, you wouldn't have a problem with that one. Next question is, if applicable, can you suggest ways of modifying the brew to provide more than maintenance? For example, more cottonseed meal, or say 15% grain. Generally, I can't, and the reason for that is what the brew is designed to do. Now, if you're wanting to increase productivity and use the brew, it actually comes down to grazing management during your growing season. If you graze effectively during the growing season, you will increase and maintain the digestibility of the feed as you're going into winter and the remainder of the dry season. Adding grain to the brew is not going to change anything significantly, because what the brew is intended to do is to be a rumen stimulator. So everything in there is designed to increase the bug population, to increase the rumen ammonia level, to let the bugs put more feed through the rumen. By putting grain in, you're actually working against that whole process. So I'd keep grain out of it wherever possible. Now, if you want more productivity and than you're getting out of the brew and out of your grazing management, then the next step is to go with bypass protein. And there you would be feeding around 1/2 kilo a day of either cottonseed meal or copra meal on the ground along a fence line. So generally what we'd be expecting out of that is about a kilo for kilo conversion rate. If you're feeding grain to increase animal performance, you're looking at somewhere between a 7 and 8 to 1 conversion rate. So that means you're feeding, regardless of whether you're feeding grams or only a 1/2 kilo a day of grain, you're going to get a conversion rate of about 7 or 8 to 1. And the economics of that with high grain prices are quite suspect. Next question, a couple more around the brew, and this is the last two. When feeding McCosker brew made by Fernie's in Dubbo, when do you know when to change the percentage of urea from, say, 8% to 16%? Now, I'm going to assume that you're feeding that to cattle because the situation is a little bit different if you're feeding it to sheep. You're feeding that to cattle, basically you would have been on it on 8% for about 10 to 14 days. By that stage, all animals will be basically on the supplement, and then you can go to 16%, and then you stay on that for about another 10 to 14 days, and then you can go up to 25%, and then another 10 to 14 days and go to 30%. The thing that's going to make urea supplementation cheaper is actually getting a higher percent urea into the supplement. So your cost per tonne of supplement might go up a little bit, but the amount of tonnes they eat is going to come back dramatically. Is there a specific, is the McCosker Brew mixed by weight or volume? It's actually mixed by weight. So that's a pretty simple one. We're just going to check through and see if there were any other questions that came up as we went through this. I'm sorry that because there's actually so many people on board, it's very difficult for me to track any questions that as they come up. Could you go over comparing cost of P between different sources again, please? Righto. Basically, you've got two choices of feeding phosphorus, either a dry lick or put it through water. If you're going through water, a proper water medicator such as a NutriDose is the way to go, and you would have to be using something like urea phosphate. And the urea within that supplement also improves the effectiveness of the phosphorus. If you're going to feed a dry lick, then basically you'd use a Kynophos or Biophos or some dicalcium phosphate source. Is supplementing with amino acids, rumen protected, worth doing? Bryce, I can't really answer that one. It's a good question. I'm not so sure that it would be, because if you just look at the way the rumen actually functions, it requires rumen ammonia. So when protein goes into the rumen, and let's assume that's just in grass or feed, that protein is converted down into peptides, then amino acids, and then into ammonia. And that ammonia then is the building block for the bugs as they rebuild themselves. And then the bugs take that ammonia plus sulfur and rebuild their own amino acids and rebuild back to what becomes microbial protein. And the amino acid balance in that microbial protein then is perfect for the requirements of the ruminant. So I'm not so sure that feeding amino acids directly to the animal is going to be worth a great deal to you. Question about how do pulses such as mung beans and chickpeas stack up against lupins? I think, again, basically you'd be buying those on a value of protein basis. Like I think mungs are about 20-odd%, chickpeas I can't quote you. But if you're buying protein, and the pulses such as mung beans, chickpeas and lupins are all degradable protein. So really you're just buying on price of protein per tonne. Why do people recommend use of bypass protein when supplementing on dead pastures? Essentially, we don't recommend using bypass protein on old pastures. I would recommend using degradable protein. So degradable protein is going to stimulate the rumen bug population, and that will get more feed through the animal and therefore more energy into the livestock. The only time you would feed bypass protein is when you're wanting higher levels of productivity. So just to put it simply, degradable protein feeds the rumen, bypass protein feeds the animal itself. So they're two entirely different systems for different reasons. Comments on free choice supplements. Yeah, I'm a believer in free choice supplements, and I think it's a great idea. And one of the extra little resources that are available with the nutrition program is an update that we've done recently on free choice supplements, how to go about it, and some case study results from it. So I'm a believer on it, provided that the supplements are in fact free choice, in that you've got 10 or 15 different nutrients out there at the same time. Another question's just come up, comments on palm kernel extract. Palm kernel extract is a very good energy feed, generally used in the dairy industries as an alternative to maize. It can be used as a protein supplement, but it is lower, much lower in protein than copra, and it has palatability issues. So generally, if you're wanting to use that, you would feed, mix it up probably 50-50 with copra to start with for about 3 weeks till they're onto it, and then gradually withdraw the copra so they'll stay on the palm kernel extract. But essentially, you're feeding bypass protein when you're feeding palm kernel extract and a lot of energy. Lambs on fresh short feed, barley grass lucerne. We have been feeding barley for energy. Would straw be better, or both? Well, you're certainly doing the right thing. They certainly, short green feed, you need energy, Matt. I would probably put straw out so that they can balance it, and then keep the grain out as well. But having roughage on short green feed is also very important for the function of the rumen. Right, I think any others have experience with animals, cattle congregating around watering points? Is fencing watering points a way of moving cattle on? If so, do you have some guidelines on distances? Certainly we have some guidelines around water points and building water points in grazing systems. The critical distance for an electric fence away from a water point is 6 to 8 metres from the centre of the trough to the centre of the gateway. All right, so I would recommend that if this is a subject that's dear to your heart and you can see that you're going to make significantly more money out of getting nutrition correct, then I'd certainly recommend that you go online and book in for one of those 2 programs that are there. I'm going to be doing follow-up on those over the next few months, and so I'll be able to answer again any questions personally that come up and run through some of the models and some of the costing pro formas, etc. So all you need to do to sign up for that is to go on to www.rcsnutrition.com.au. Certainly if you want to learn a lot more and have access to the spreadsheets and the tools available to help you make better decisions around nutrition, and also access to myself over the next 6 months or so, please sign up to one of the products on the website. Thanks very much.